and welcome to the Internexus San Diego podcast. My name is Bryan Whitman, and I'll be hosting your podcast today on this Thursday. And let's get started. So this podcast is about all of the things happening here in the United States in June about the George Floyd protest. On March 25th, 2020, a Minneapolis shop clerk called the police after a black man tried to buy cigarettes with a counterfeit $20 bill. 4 police officers arrived at the scene and placed the suspect in handcuffs. Shortly after arresting George Floyd, a white officer pinned him down on the ground and began kneeling on his neck. As George Floyd begged for his life, several bystanders captured his death on video. The graphic footage of George Floyd's death began to circulate on social media, and protests erupted in the streets of Minneapolis and several other U.S. cities. The protesters called for an end to racial injustice in their country and communities. They held Black Lives Matter signs and chanted, "I can't breathe," and "Hands up, don't shoot." People of all races were marching for justice for George Floyd and all Black Americans killed in police custody, including Eric Garner, Michael Brown, and Freddie Gray. 2 days after George Floyd's death, the 4 police officers on the case were fired. On March 29th, Derek Chauvin, the officer who knelt on Floyd's neck for over 8 minutes, was arrested and charged with third-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter. The Floyd family spoke on behalf of protesters across the country, saying that all 4 officers should be charged. In an historic moment caught on camera, Minneapolis Police Chief Merida Arando agreed with the Floyd family, saying that, in his opinion, silence is complacency. In some cities, police officers joined protesters on their knees to acknowledge the need for police reform. As George Floyd's family and supporters waited for further charges, some protests grew violent. Some protesters set fire to police vehicles, and others saw an opportunity for looting and vandalism. The violence caused city officials to impose curfews and closures. As the unrest worsened, the Floyd family called for demonstrations and protest peacefully and to use their voices to vote. On the 17th night of the protest, President Trump threatened to use military force to crack down on protesters, saying that "I am your president of law and order." He encouraged all cities and states to call the National Guard and threatened to send in the U.S. military if they didn't. During the president's speech, the police used tear gas and rubber bullets to clear out peaceful protests near the White House and St. John's Church, the church of the presidents. This allowed the president to cross the street and take a photo outside of the vandalized church. On June 3rd, the day before George Floyd's funeral, Chauvin's charged with upgraded to second-degree murder, and the other 3 officers were charged with aiding and abetting a crime. Some of the vocabulary that you heard in this podcast was counterfeit. Counterfeit means fake or forge or not real. A bystander is a person who witnessed an event but does not actively participate. Graphic means to show a very clear and realistic picture of something. Justice means of what is right and fair. And custody is the state of being held by police. Some other vocabulary words that you heard in this podcast were complacency. That means the act of the time that one needs to be home or indoors. Looting involves taking something and stealing something from a store, or vandalism. Vandalism is an act of destroying property. To crack down means to take strict or disciplinary measures. And a curfew is a time that one needs to be at home or indoors by. And looting means an act of stealing from a vandalized building or business. So these are some of the vocabulary words that you heard in this podcast. I want to say thank you for listening to this podcast. I want to say that hopefully we can get to justice in my country. I love my country, and I believe in protesting. I think it's the greatest thing in the world, and hope that everything turns out in the best way it can. My name is Bryan Whitman, and thank you for listening to this podcast.